All right, thanks for coming. And as a professor, I always, it's kind of, you're welcome to move in if you'd like, and, but you don't have to, but you can. There's lots of room. So what I'm going to talk about today is the research that I've been doing for many years at NASA, and with an eye toward applying it to what you are doing. Decision-making and communication is something that I've been working on for a number of years. And as you know from your own environments, people can work now from anywhere. You can work from your house, you can work from an airplane, you can work from a conference room, you can work from anywhere. And indeed, some people take more advantage of this opportunity than others. And you never know, when you call someone in a work, whether that person is in the office and wherever. So anyways, but you can work from anywhere. And one result of this is that what used to be a face-to-face team meeting around a table, talking to each other, is now often separated by time and space. And if you're in an organization of any size and you haven't worked in a remote team setting yet, you probably will. It's something that's coming to all industries and all domains. And once you get of a certain size and you start interacting with people in the rest of the world, you're going to have remote teams. So I'm going to talk today about the research that I've been doing with my colleagues and my students on remote teams. And I'm going to focus on two of the projects that I've been doing. And I want to tell you a little bit about them so you know where the research is coming from. One is called single pilot operations. So you know that right now when you go in your 777 and you go anywhere across the ocean, that there are two pilots in the cockpit, right? A captain and a co-pilot working together and talking to air traffic control on the ground. Well, you also probably know that the technology to fly the airplane without a pilot is there. There are unmanned aerial vehicles that are now in the airspace, and they're functioning successfully. And the notion now is to see whether you could do the same job that you do with two pilots in the air by having one pilot in the cockpit and support personnel on the ground with the technological capabilities to take over the airplane if necessary. And again, the technology is there. One of the drivers is of course cost. Another driver is using the technology that's there. And some other drivers have to do with whether it could be more successful managed that way with a remote team, one person on the ground, one person in the air. So how do you do that? How do you communicate? How do you manage your resources? And how do you make decisions successfully if you've got a team that's distributed between the air and the ground flying an airplane? So that's one area of research that we're doing, and we're looking specifically at what's going to happen to something called crew resource management, which now is mostly internal to the aircraft and somewhat on the ground. And in the case of single pilot operations, will be much more distributed between the air and the ground. So that's one project. The other project, and I'm just now venturing into space. I've been working mostly in aviation for my career, but now we're looking into space, and we're looking at asynchronous communication in space operations, because they're planning to go far, and they're planning on communicating, sending data back and forth. One of the missions that's planned in the near future is a fly around Mars. The technology is there to do it. The technology is not yet there to land a spacecraft and get it back to Earth. So the first thing they're going to do is this pass. And as they're traveling, the communication delays for sending data and communications will vary between 5 and 20 minutes each way. So if you think that it's difficult now to communicate with people that are on the other side of the world, imagine having to do it when it takes 5 minutes for your message, or 10 minutes, or 20 minutes to get to them. They have to comprehend it, formulate a reply, send it back to you. It takes another 10 to 20 minutes. In the meantime, you may think of something else and send something else, and they may think of something else and send something else, and you're trying to track which messages go with which. You're trying to keep a thread of conversation. You're trying to keep your thoughts coherent. So there are a lot of issues, as you might imagine, involved in this asynchronous form of communication. So that's the other project that we're doing. So what I'm telling you today is drawing from each of those. And my presentation might be a little bit more researchy and less glitzy than some of the ones that you'll see at this conference, but I think that I'll offer you a complementary perspective to what you'll get from other people here. So, and some of the first remote teams were in aviation. So for many, many years, teams of air traffic controllers and pilots have been successfully managing all the air traffic, the landing at airports, the taking off, the flying in the sky, the routes has been successfully managed by remote teams. Now you've also got remote teams in space. So here you've got one team member inside the shuttle, several team members outside the shuttle doing a task and trying to communicate with each other about the task. And then you've got the people on the ground that maybe have some information that they need to perform the task. So you've got even a more remote team than in aviation. And as I mentioned, soon you'll have really, really remote teams that you'll have to deal with. So how do you collaborate with people that are on Mars? How do you collaborate across time and space and make sure that you're making effective and good decisions? Okay, so what I'm going to talk about today are issues that we've identified and lessons that we've learned from some of the NASA research that I've been doing, and also culled from elsewhere, from literature on remote teams that I've had to look at for the projects and from other domains. I'm going to talk about some of the advantages and disadvantages of remote teams, some of the issues that remote teams will have, and how some ways to facilitate effective communication and decisions when you're dealing with remote teams. And I've also built in time for questions, so we can do them anytime you want or at the end, whichever you prefer. So feel free if you have a question. All right, some of the advantages of remote teams include you have flexibility and customization. So your person that you want that's an expert may be located in Tokyo or New York. So you have the ability with the remote teams to put that person on a team and get that person involved in the decision-making process. So there's some flexibility that allows you the ability to take advantage of distributed expertise. So maybe your best marketing person is in a different place. Maybe your IT person is in a different place. With remote teams, you can take advantage of that expertise. One of the things that we found from remote teams is that status effects may be lessened. So people may be more willing to contribute input to people that are above them on the organization hierarchy if they're remote than if they're sitting at a table with the person. So there is some evidence that you can reduce some status effects and get input from people across the board in the hierarchy. Also, there's some evidence that shows that teams, remote teams, may make more realistic projections and less risky decisions because they're distributed and may not be in the heart of what's going on, so they may be able to evaluate things from a more long-term perspective or a more objective perspective than someone who is in the middle of it. So there are several advantages to using remote teams. Some of the disadvantages of using remote teams are there's no physical interaction. So some people feel uncomfortable if they don't see the person that they're dealing with or don't have physical interactions with that person because you don't get the chance to get the face-to-face synergies and develop a rapport when you're talking with someone who's across the world. There are some problems with mistrust and miscommunications because if you don't build in opportunities to develop trust with remote team members, it's very hard to do that from a distance. And communication may be an issue. I'll talk about that more at length. There's some research has shown that remote teams have a greater concern for predictability and reliability and may value those things over some things that might be a little bit less predictable, a little bit more risky, but might in the long term turn out better for the organization. And lastly, one of the things that makes teams a fun thing to be in is a social interaction. And if you don't have the teams on site, there's a lack of social interaction. So that may be a problem, a disadvantage of using a remote team. Some of the disadvantages in terms of decision-making and decision-making strategies, when you've got a team that's scattered across the country or across the world, you may get team members that are more concerned with maintaining their position and their power rather than pooling information. So maybe the guy in New York or the woman in New York thinks that if they hold on to some information, it will increase their power. And rather than give the information to the rest of the team members to facilitate the team's goals, they may hold on to it. And there's no one to kind of confront them about that if it's a remote team. There are a lack of social cues to guide your interactions. So when you're face-to-face with someone, you can pick up on social information by watching the person's responses to you, where the person stands, whether the person fidgets or not, whether the person is sitting back with his hands behind his head, kind of relaxing. So you don't get those kind of social cues. There's, and I said once that the remote teams may make less risky decisions, but it also can go the other way because isolation and anonymity can foster hostile behavior and extreme decision making. So if something happens and someone in your remote team gets a little bit miffed and you're not there to smooth that over, or you may not even know that it's happened, it can escalate and it may end up fostering a sense of hostility, resentment, which could be a disadvantage for your team. Okay.
What do you mean by extreme decision?
Kind of like the most risky or maybe the most conservative at either end of the decision spectrum. That would be most extreme. All right, so the issues that I'm going to talk about for remote teams are today, and there are more than these, but these are some that I've pulled out that are really important, I think, are leadership, trust, team dynamics, culture, affect, communication, and decision-making. So I'm going to go through a little bit of what we know about those, and then there's more about that. If you need references, I can give you more. Okay, so first, leadership. The research on leadership and remote teams has some evidence that a shared and kind of informal leadership may be better for remote teams than having one formal leader in one geographical location. So you may want to consider sharing the leadership functions across a remote team, as well, of course, as the accountability. It doesn't do any good if you have a shared leadership, but the accountability is not also shared. So you want to distribute accountability as well as leadership. Informal roles may work a little better than formal leaders when you're talking about a distributed team. And some of the functions of the leader's role, which are important in any team, but maybe even more important when you're talking about remote teams, are things like establishing positive team processes and a climate of trust. That's going to be really important because the processes, once they're set in motion, it's difficult to go back and fix them. So from the beginning, what you want is good processes. You want to develop supportive team member relations. So the leaders need to be supportive of the team members need to know that they can go to the leader when they need to. You need to create team-based reward systems. So that will help to ameliorate the person that's trying to hold on to information or power. It may ameliorate the tendency towards hostile decisions. If the rewards are based on what the team does rather than any individual in the team, that may help to smooth some of the difficulties of remote teams. And this is true for face-to-face teams as well. And you want to select, be careful when you're forming your team, because the team needs to be made of members that have the expertise that you want. So you need to be able to select only the members who have the relevant qualifications and expertise, because not the FLAC members, but the ones that are kind of extra, the padding, it's harder to control what happens with that when you've got a team that's scattered all over the world. And what does that person do? One of the things they need is clear roles and responsibilities. If you're going to be in a remote team, trust is really difficult to establish, especially if you've never seen people or never worked with them before. Personal contact and familiarity can foster trust, and later I'm going to talk a little bit about the importance of having some face-to-face contact to develop that. And you really want to do something to develop trust in remote teams because it can really lower the adverse impact of geographical distribution. And after all, if you're going to ask people to follow you over the bridge, they need to trust that you've checked the bridge, that it works, that it's not going to collapse underneath them. So you really need to have that trust element, and it is an issue for remote teams. Another thing is team dynamics, which you'll see in any team, and some of them may be exacerbated or heightened when you've got remote teams. So some of the things that you see in face-to-face teams may be exacerbated. For example, you know the term social loafing? So have you ever been in a team where somebody didn't do anything? One person didn't do anything? Or maybe 2 or 3 people carried the ball and the rest of the people just kind of loafed? So imagine if that happens in teams where people are meeting with each other, how much more likely that possibility is when someone is across the world and you really don't have a process to track that person and monitor what the person is doing. So the tendency towards social loafing may be heightened. Status effects may be reduced, and that would be a good thing for remote teams. So that's a positive thing in terms of team dynamics. One negative thing is that the tendency toward attribution errors might be increased in remote teams, especially for negative events. So a lot of the research on attribution shows that we kind of attribute the cause to what we see or what we know. So if you're the actor and something happens that's a negative event, you tend to look to the situation to define the cause of it, rather than to yourself. Right? Because you say, well, I could have done it if only this hadn't happened, or I could have done it if so-and-so had done his part, or I could have done it if I'd had this support, or whatever. So you tend to look at the situation to define negative events. When you're observing events that some other person is involved in across the country, the tendency is to look at the person because you don't know the situation. So when you're attributing the cause of a negative event, you may have a tendency to blame it on the person rather than examining the situation. And they call this a fundamental attribution error in the social psychology literature. And that can be heightened when you're talking about remote teams because the person's not there to give you his or her perspective. In-group and out-group bias may be magnified. So if you're here, and especially if you've got a small group of 2 or 3 of you here, okay, that becomes your in-group. And you tend to place more trust in your in-group, and then the people that are in other places tend to become the out-group. And some of the biases that have been identified in terms of in-groups and out-groups and how you treat them and how you assign causality, those kinds of things can also be exacerbated when you're talking about a remote team. Another thing that is an issue for remote teams is culture, especially if you're dealing with teams that are distributed across the world. There's been a lot of research and Hofstede has done a lot of this research on national culture, especially looking at Eastern and Western cultures. And so Western cultures tend to be more individualistic, valuing individual accomplishments, valuing individual contributions, valuing, the lone guy going out, the leader doing his or her thing, or the woman that's doing that. Collectivism is more oriented towards the group. So if you're working with cultures that are opposite you, you have to take that into consideration. There are different power distances in different cultures. So in the US, we have a relatively flat power distance. But when you're talking about Eastern cultures, you may have a higher power distance. They found a lot of evidence in cockpit resource management that they can't take the same programs that they have in the US to airlines that are in third world or Eastern countries because the power distance is different and some of the practices that we teach don't work so well when you're talking about those other countries. So you really have to take that into consideration when you're thinking of remote teams. Tolerance for ambiguity, tolerance for uncertainty. Different cultures have different levels of tolerance for that. Different cultures rely more on rules and order. So you may, Germans are famous for adhering to rules and order, stereotypically. Some other cultures, Americans are famous, some of us for flaunting rules and order. So you've got different things that you're working with. Masculinity, femininity, the roles that you attribute to people based on their gender. So the evidence is that there's a lot of variance within a culture as well as across culture on these items. But the important thing for remote teams is being sensitive to some of these differences and aware of them and making sure that you are checking things out when you're interacting with people in remote teams. There's also the notion of a professional culture. So in your organization, it might be a difference between your management and your IT people, that there are different cultures. You know, the techies that work all night around the clock, they eat pizza, the management who comes in a three-piece suit. I don't know if this is true in your organization or not, but there's differences in those kinds of cultures. And you may find that that's an issue as well. Something that we're dealing with in the single pilot operations is that if the person that's on the ground is not a pilot, maybe is a dispatcher or maybe is a maintenance person that's helping out, there are different professional cultures for pilots than there are for other people within airline organizations. And so we'll have to be sensitive to how that's going to impact the interactions among these team members. And your organizational culture as well, even if people are in the same organization or you're working across organizations, there are differences in how workload is managed between organizations, who makes the decisions, how problems are solved. Are they solved by everybody talking together? Are decisions made authoritarian by one person? Are decisions made collectively? So there are differences between organizations and how those things are solved. So culture is an issue for remote teams. Another issue that you might not think of right away is affect. Affective responses can impact the cohesiveness of a team, participation of the team members, information processing, how you take in and absorb information, as well as performance. When you're talking about a remote team, emotional dynamics may be hidden, may not surface, especially if you're not seeing any visual cues with your remote team. They may be delayed because a communication may be sent, a person may have a chance to mull over something or stew about something and may have a delayed effective response to something that's going on with the team. Team members may have different perspectives and different priorities depending on where they are, what their station is, what their role is, and what their goal is. And effective responses to a particular event or situation or scenario may not be shared across team members. And I've got this picture of the aircraft and the tower up there because we found out when we looked at a set of incident reports in the aviation. NASA has something called the ASRS system, and it's a safety mechanism. It's an anonymous reporting system for pilots, air traffic controllers, and anybody involved in the airline industry or the airline whole operations to submit an anonymous report of an incident that happened. So we tracked several incidents. We had over like 140 of them where there were communication breakdowns between air traffic control and the cockpit. And one of the things we found that was an indicator of an inappropriate resolution, such as blowing off the pilot or giving them a penalty hold or putting them behind another aircraft or whatever, was a difference in the concern levels of the aircraft, the pilots in the aircraft, and the people on the ground. So if the pilots were concerned about something and they didn't hear the same level of concern reflected in the air traffic controller's response, they got upset about it. So it wasn't what was going on, but it was the response to what was going on that would upset them, and they would say something that would indicate that they were not happy, and the controllers would say something back to them, and that would escalate and turn a breakdown into a conflict. So affect is something that you definitely have to be aware of. Yes?
We also ever looked at how people might try to, put those body cues, their body language, their voice.
I will.
Some people are better at that than others.
Yes, some people are better, and I'll talk about different media for communication and how people try and deal with this. But yes, and you can hear communication in the airline industry is very standardized, very proceduralized, and you say certain specific things. And when people, one thing that you can tell is when they go off script, and you'll say, things like, "Oh, I thought I told you to," or "What do you think you're doing?" or things that are really not in the procedures. You can tell that there's something affective going on, right? Okay, so. And communication. Communication's definitely going to be one of the biggest issues for remote teams. Because information exchange, which is one of the most important goals of communication, may be hindered by an inability to read physical cues, which is common in many communication media, insufficient information processing, so maybe the person thinks of something, but he knows it's the middle of the night for you, so doesn't bother to communicate it with you, so the information doesn't get to you. Transmission errors, so you may forget something, you may forget to say it, you may misunderstand something that somebody else sends to you. Human and technical, you may have, if you've ever had a Skype failure, some kind of disconnect when you're talking to someone, you know that those technical failures can be communication problems. And also you've got differing environments and differing situational factors which may impact communication among remote teams. Most remote teams will use a variety of communication and collaboration tools, and some of the research has shown that if you use the best tools and the right tools, you can equalize remote and face-to-face teams. And in some cases, remote teams can even do things faster than face-to-face teams using the appropriate technology. So if you're dealing with remote teams, something that you really need to do is make sure that you've got the most updated and the best technology for communication. So each medium has its own pluses and minuses. So visual communication, for example, gives a sense of personal contact. You're seeing the people. It's nice, you know, when you're talking to family members or other people on Skype, you can see their face. It's very good. So visual, and you can get nonverbal cues because you can see the person's face. You can hear the person's voice. Visual media have been found to be beneficial in developing team relations. If people meet sort of face-to-face, it's helpful. It offers immediate contact with your members, your team members, if you're looking right at them and you're talking. It offers immediate feedback on understanding. So if you see something and say something and you see a puzzled look, you can immediately clarify it and make sure that misunderstandings don't proliferate. It's been shown to lead to significant improvements in decision quality. So discussing a decision via visual media is helpful for decision quality. And it may be important for communication in high context cultures. So Eastern cultures have been shown to be kind of more high context in which the tone and the gesture is important. So if you're communicating with people in high context cultures, it may be more efficient for processes to use a visual medium. There is, however, no record of the message. One of the things we found in our studies of the asynchronous communication for space is that once you say something, it's gone on the other end. So if you're saying it, takes 5 minutes to get to them, they miss the first sentence. So it's another 5 minutes for them to send back to you saying, what did you say in that first part? So then it's another 10-minute round trip before they get the clarification. Same with remote teams. If you're using talking, visual, audio media, once you say something, it's gone. And there's no record of it for your permanent records and to go back to later, unless you record it or you have agreements to do that. That is true also for audio resources, which have most of the same advantages of video, but not all. You don't get to see the person. You can get audio cues, but you may not get those visual cues about what the person is thinking, feeling, reacting to what you're saying. Some of the advantages, well, maybe when you get a phone call, at 3 in the morning from one of your partners on the other side of the world, you may not want to have a visual link up. You may prefer to sit in your pajamas or, drinking your coffee with your hair all askew, whatever, and not have the visual cues. So there are some advantages to not having that visual cue. And again, the audio is the immediate kind of communication. Another version is using things like text and email. Those are good because they provide you with a record of communications. If the person doesn't remember what you were communicating, the person can go back and look at the text, look at the email. These kinds of resources respect the difference in time zones because you can read your email when you wake up in the morning instead of having to do it at 3 in the morning if it's an audio or visual call. It enables you to give thoughtful consideration of the message before you respond, which you don't have when you're face-to-face on a video contact before you respond. Gives you time to consider, may work better for team members in low context cultures. Some of our Participants in our studies prefer text because they can type everything they want and they're used to texting. We're seeing, it's interesting, we thought when we're doing this async study, we have students coming in and they're using either either voice communication or text communication. And we thought for sure when they were using text communication, they'd take advantage of it to type these long messages and send them. They don't. They do like they do on Twitter. You know, they write a line and they send it. They write another line and they send it. So we may see some generational differences here in the preference for communication media. On the other hand, things like text can't be used by astronauts when they're doing EVA because they're in suits and they can't manipulate anything, so that then they're stuck with voice. So some of the situation may put constraints on which medium you can use. One other good thing, yeah, really, how big do you have to make the buttons when you're pressing it if you've got a big glove on? Yeah, okay. Also, text enables a better chunking of information. And when you're trying to keep threads of conversation going about different conversations about different things that you're talking about, it's good to have the ability to chunk things so people can keep it together. Okay. Yes. Okay, this is right up the alley of the Kanban method. A lot of the teamwork has started using electronic whiteboards and other tools, so even when you're remote, you can use stickies, you can track things, move them around on a whiteboard, so that's another resource that some remote teams are using to collaborate. So all of these teams' tools are available for use. When you're choosing the medium to use, one of the things is to be really mindful of time. One of the things that's found to be very disruptive in remote teams are disruptions in timing. And interestingly, they've found when they've had even a 50-second or 1-minute time delay sending messages into space, one of the interesting things is that the people on either end are disconcerted if they don't see a response, an effective response to what they're saying, even though the person on the other end hasn't gotten the message yet. So they're expecting, you know, I'm telling you that the system is broken and we're going to die, and you're just sitting there not reacting at all. Well, it's because I haven't gotten the message yet. So disruptions in time are shown to be very, very conducive to all kinds of bad things. And so you need to be cognizant of time and timing when you're working with remote teams. Local time versus team member time, and waiting for responses. You will have to get used to waiting for a response if you're doing something and you know that the other team member is sleeping at the point where you send the response. When can you collaborate? Well, what kind of tool are you using? How are you doing your collaborations? Do you need to be in the same time, or can you do it at different times? Can it be asynchronous? When can you expect a response? So if you send a message to someone, or if you're sending some information, when is the soonest that you can expect a response from this message, given that you know what time it is in that person's time zone? So those are things that you need to be very clear about. So those are some of the issues that are involved in communication when you're talking about remote teams. And I'm going to move on to decision making. Did you have any questions right now about communication or media? Okay. So this conference is about decision making. So I'm going to spend some time focusing on decision making. The type of decision-making that I've looked at has to do with dynamic environments, and as I said, mostly in aviation. And they've identified a different, a set of decisions that many may apply to your environment, some may not, but many of them will apply. One is the go, no-go decision, and in that I'm talking about, for example, is this pilot going to take off or not? So looking at the weather, looking at the runway, looking at the traffic, looking at all the information, do you go or do you not go? And a lot of times these decisions are basically procedural. So you have rules to follow. If this, then you go. If that, then you don't go. So you may have those kinds of rules when you're designing your production, when you're figuring out where to put things, or you may response selection decisions. You may have a choice of several different ways to do things, or several different products to start on, or several different methods of distribution to choose. So you're choosing among a set of responses. You may be deciding how to manage your resources. So you may have to figure out, what do I have available to me? You may be doing a sensitivity analysis. I forgot what, sensitivity delayed analysis, or delay sensitivity analysis that David Anderson was talking about yesterday. So what's my options in terms of my resources? Where do I go? How risky do I want to be? You may want to allocate your resources one way depending on the level of risk that it entails and the certainty of meeting your goals. There are also non-diagnostic procedural decisions where there are several procedures. So once you know you're in the cockpit, you've got an alarm that says you've got an engine fire, then you know exactly what to do. There are procedures that you follow, and you've got your procedures set out for you that may be true for you or not. There are something called recognition prime decisions, which is a variety of expert decision-making, which is a whole field of study in itself called naturalistic decision-making. And it posits that experts have a store of experiences, of events that have occurred within their domain. And they put these events into patterns. And when something happens where they have to make a decision, they can pull out a pattern that's familiar to the situation at hand. And they don't have to go through the notion of evaluating and weighing alternative options, because they've got this pattern that matches what's going on, and they think that this one will work because it's worked before with this pattern. So expert decision making and pattern matching has been shown to be a lot more intuitive than some of the analytical decision making that people who don't have that experience store have to do. So there are recognition prime decisions. And also there are decisions where there's just, you don't know what to do. You have to do some creative problem solving. The Apollo mission where they had to Apollo 13, where Houston, we have a problem, but they didn't know exactly how they were going to solve the problem. Those kinds of events where you really have to come up with something creative to solve it. So there are all kinds of decisions. And effective decision-making for remote teams is going to be, like for any other team, a result of the inputs plus the processes. So how do you create remote teams for effective decision-making? So one thing is pay attention to team development. Just as in the cockpit, you wouldn't want to put two pilots who have on their first flight in that aircraft, you wouldn't want to assign them to go together. You wouldn't want to assign people to a team where you've left out one critical area of expertise. You need to create a remote team that has what you need and pay attention to the way that it's developed, because appropriate team development processes are important for cohesiveness of the team down the line, as well as for the team's satisfaction with the way that they're working. One thing that's true for remote teams, maybe more than face-to-face teams, is that remote team members need to have clear roles and responsibilities, because you won't be able to monitor and revise them and tweak them as easily as you could do if the people are right there with you. So you need to have clear roles and responsibilities identified for your remote team members. One thing that is true from the research is that effective teams know each other, and familiarity can counteract a lot of ill effects of other events. Early research on NASA cockpit crews showed that crews that knew each other could counteract effects of fatigue that were debilitating for crews that maybe were just starting off with each other. So if you had a crew that had worked together for 4 days, even though they were really, really tired, they'd had a long day, it's the last day of their 4 days, it's the last leg, something awful happens, or some system fails or whatever, the teams that had been together for 4 days will do better than a fresh team who's just starting out together and don't know each other. So familiarity goes a long way towards improving team processes. So a face-to-face meeting, however you can arrange that, either via a Skype or some kind of a visual connection, or by having the leader go to the different sites, having team members travel to different sites, goes a long way towards improving team cohesiveness. It allows team members to get acquainted with each other, to clarify what your process, how are you going to operate, what your processes are, make sure everybody's goals are the same, the priorities are the same, you're on the same page, clarify the roles and the function of the team, learn how you will communicate, what communication technologies you'll use and when and how. It helps you to build trust in team relations, as I mentioned before, and all of those things together lead to higher levels of cooperation and trust, and also increased team effectiveness. So face-to-face meetings, if you're working in remote teams, are a really valuable way to start out a team. It's a really valuable input for your team. And then if you move on to process, one of the most important processes when you're talking about remote teams is developing shared mental models. So do all team members everywhere have the same model of what the situation is, what the goals are, what the priority is, what the information is? Does everyone have the same information and is on the same page? It's relatively easy to do that when you're sitting next to each other, wherever, or when you're face-to-face, because you talk to each other, you have a lot of nonverbal things. So when one pilot does something, the other pilot points as an acknowledgement that it's been done. They both know what's going on. So it's easier to develop a shared mental model. When you start introducing remote team members, it becomes harder. How much information does that remote team member need to have, and how will you convey it to them? How do you create a shared mental model on shared priorities? So one of the things in aviation is that the air traffic controller's priority is traffic flow, safe and efficient traffic flow. The cockpit member's priority is the safety of his or her aircraft. And sometimes those priorities may conflict. So when you introduce remote team members, you've got to make sure that they have the same priorities and the same goals. And when you're doing that, you're going to have to be worried about establishing common ground across time and space, across the world, across the country, across wherever it is that you're working with this remote team. And it's really important to have shared mutual knowledge and shared mental models. It's necessary because you can't communicate effectively unless you have this shared knowledge. It's necessary to ensure that everyone understands knowledge and information in the same way. It's necessary because your team members are going to shape their contributions to the discussion, to the process, based on what they know, right? And if they don't have the shared knowledge, they'll be basing their contributions on something that's different from what you are. And also because it avoids false assumptions about what's going on, about what's needed, about what's important, about what's next. So it's really important to maintain mutual knowledge among remote team members. However, it's also difficult because the task-relevant information may be dispersed across locations. So one of the issues now in aviation is that the air and the ground have different versions of the weather. So the ground has a different perspective on the weather than the people in the air do. So one of the things they're talking about doing when they have this next generation of operations in airspace is trying to make sure the same displays, the same information, the same kinds of things are available to all of the team members, both in the air and in the ground. The same is true when you're talking about increasing autonomy and increasing space operations, the degree of communication and the ability of teams to function in space. You want to make sure they have as much of the information that the ground people have as possible, and that they're sharing the same information about what's going on. So what did I do there? Okay, difficult because I just hit a key, sorry. Okay, and it's key bits of information may only appear in a certain location, and maybe that person doesn't realize the importance of this key bit of information, so may not even think to convey it to you, so you may have to elicit it, so make sure you're getting the input that you need. And also it's difficult because remote teams don't have as many interactions as face-to-face teams. When you're working on the same site with your team, you run into each other in the hall. You might meet every week. But now when you're talking about remote teams, you probably won't have as many interactions as you do with a face-to-face team. So what do you do to maintain this mutual knowledge, this shared knowledge? One thing is that you create a climate that is open to input, both questions, ideas, and information. And one of the ways to do that is to use the technology to your maximum advantage. Take advantage of whatever technology that you have and use the strategies that are appropriate for the technology. So as I said, you may want to send bulks of information via text or email or those kinds of packages. You may want to share other kinds of information using a visual mode. So use all of the technology that you have to facilitate what you're doing and create a climate where everyone is free to contribute because you want that everyone to contribute. One of the things that they do in the cockpit, they have this training called monitoring and challenging. One of the problems that they found early in this resource management, and the whole concept of resource management started when they discovered that they did a simulation down at NASA Ames, and they had a big problem where the crews in the simulator left New York and had a problem with an engine blew, and they had to turn around and come back and land. And they had to dump fuel, they had to prepare, they had to do all these things. And interesting what they found was that the crews that did the worst didn't do it because they didn't have the resources to solve the problem and do well. They did it because they didn't use the resources that they had. They mismanaged or didn't know how to manage the resources that they had. And so this whole notion of managing resources came about. And one of the things that prevented the cockpit from using all of its resources was that the first officer was very reluctant to speak up. And the captain, who was the four-striper, was often very reluctant to accept input. And so they developed this kind of a devil's advocate kind of process where the person that's not flying is called the pilot monitoring. And that person's job is not only to monitor what the other pilot is doing, but also to challenge whatever he or she sees that may not be, that there's a concern about. And they even have language. Each airline has its own language for the monitoring process or the challenging process. And starting out with, I'm uncomfortable, to we really don't want to do that kinds of things. So they have language to facilitate this process. But that's something you might want to introduce to make sure that you get the input, to make sure that the person that's sitting on the other side of the world that really has a legitimate doubt about the course of action that you're thinking about taking, gets a chance to voice that doubt and be heard by the rest of the team members. Another thing that will facilitate the sharing of knowledge is to use the right communication tools. So figure out what's right for what you want to do and make sure that you use that appropriate tool. I lost count, but another thing that you need to do is to know the environment within which you're making decisions. Pay attention to the important cues. So the pilot in the cockpit has to know not only what's inside the cockpit and look at the array of information that's there, but also what's outside the cockpit. And one of the pitfalls of using only the inside cues, for example, is that all the information that you get inside and all the sophisticated automated systems that you have inside will not tell you if there's a truck on the runway. You have to be able to look outside and integrate that information. And you have to be able to look at this array of cues and say, okay, in this situation, I want to pay attention to this. This is the important thing to look at right now. And this is the pattern that I expect to see that tells me that it's safe to land and that things are going well. So develop the skill to recognize patterns and foster that in your team members. The pattern recognition skills, sets of scenarios. Listen to your experts. Make sure that if you've chosen someone because they're an expert in IT or an expert in marketing, make sure that you listen to that person. After all, you chose these people based on their expertise. Make sure that you listen to them. And because you may not be as familiar with that domain as they are, they may be using different information to make decisions than you use, and they may be having this store of experiences that they're drawing on that you do not have. And I was reminded that we have a book out there that talks about how experts in different domains use this kind of pattern matching, use the intuitive techniques, use things to make decisions. I forgot that we had it at this conference, but it is there, and it includes chapters by one of our other speakers, Dave Snowden, who's going to do the keynote tomorrow morning. So if you're interested in what experts have to say in different domains about making decisions, you might want to check it out there. It's called Informed by Knowledge. But listen to your experts. Domain expertise is very valuable. One of the things that they do in aviation is they use scenario-based training for teams. And this is a simulator. It's a 6 degrees of freedom simulator, meaning it goes up and down and sideways and up and down this way. So it pitches up, down. So when you are in the simulator, you feel like you're flying. And if you've ever gone on one of those rides, they have rides that kind of try to mimic this. But this is a 747 simulator that's down at NASA Ames. And this is the inside of the simulator. So you've got the pilots, and you've got the out the window view. And then you've got the screen on the side. You see the screen on the side? And the person that sits on the side and the person that says, okay, rainstorm, hits a button and there's a rainstorm. Okay, engine fail, hits a button and there's an engine fail. Okay, you lost your oil pressure, hits a button and there's lost oil pressure. So the crews have to deal with particular situations. So this is a very high fidelity way of practicing different scenarios. And you won't be using simulators, most of you in your domains, but you may have run-throughs for particular situations. You may simulate, okay, what happens if we make this decision? And simulate your way through it, okay? Draw it out over the next 6 months. What are the possibilities? How is it likely to go? Practice making those kinds of decisions with your team so that you develop, the store of hypothetical scenarios so that you get used to saying, oh, we talked about this, and wasn't there the danger that this would happen if we went this way, and that this would not happen if we went this way? So you've got a store of things that you can draw on. So scenario-based practice, that is, examples with specific to your domain, is something that's also very helpful. Okay, and another thing, the literature talks about metacognitive skills. When you're talking about working with remote teams, metacognition is kind of thinking about how you're thinking. So it's monitoring how you're making decisions and double-checking that you're making decisions in the way that's appropriate, that you've looked at everything that you should be looking at, consulted with the appropriate experts, looked down the line, done some mental simulation to see how things may pan out, that you've really monitored your cognitive processes as well as your team processes. So develop those metacognitive skills to check in with what you're doing. Okay? And one last thing that is also really important is once you make a decision, and you've made a decision for your team, and your team is proceeding in a certain direction, you want to always reassess. Is this playing out as you imagined? Is it as safe as you thought? Are there dangers that you didn't foresee that are going to come and get you? So pay attention and revisit and reevaluate your decisions, as these guys should have done before they headed in this direction. Okay. And that is the end of the formal talk. Thank you. Thank you. So it's kind of a big data dump. Do you have questions? Yes. Oh, Mike?
Got a mic.
Good.
I'm just kind of curious about the, I guess, the more formal protocols. So they have that kind of, just the language that's used. So the whole monitor and challenge thing, which sound almost like was normal English. We just said that when I say this normal sounding phrase, that actually means this.
Right.
Especially for the more, like let's say the Mars thing, like where there's significant delays. Is there anything about more formal protocols where it is more like, almost like I'm thinking more like the radio comm style thing where you are saying very specific, readily identifiable things to indicate stuff, including stuff you talk about affect. So if I'm feeling uncomfortable, I don't sort of hint at being uncomfortable. I actually have a phrase that I say discomfort and then blah.
Yeah. So airlines started to do those kinds of things because they had to come up with a non-threatening way for a first officer to indicate concern to the captain and get the captain to pay attention. So they've had to introduce specific phrases, and those are keys to the captain or the team leader, in this case the captain, that, uh-oh, I need to pay attention to this. This means that. And we've also, you know, when you're talking about remote teams, there is a loss of the affective cues. So we're thinking in many cases that language may need to be more proceduralized if you're going to convey some of the affective responses. On the other hand, other things that you mentioned, such as like typical radio communications, one of the things that they found with astronauts working with a time delay is that they would say things like, got your message, or got that, or roger that. And by the time the people at Mission Control got that, they had no idea which got that they were talking about, because in the meantime, they had sent a bunch of other messages. So part of our training for communications involves, you know, referring to the content of what you're talking about, so keeping something about the content. And I think that that's going to have to happen when you're talking about remote teams, that you can't assume that the person is in the same context that you are, remembers where you were or what you said last night when you sent the message at 7 p.m. and they're getting it at 7 a.m. their time, and, you know, responding it to several hours later. So you need to give more cues about what's the context of the message, what is your, you know, what is your affective, if affect is important, or more than just the words of the message. And it's going to be a challenge in remote teams to figure out, you know, what works for your organization. So maybe you don't want to use a phrase like, I'm uncomfortable with that, but you may have something else that you want to kind of standardize, that this is from, you know, the lowly techie that we just hired, who's kind of at the bottom of the chain for this group, or the whoever it is, the new salesperson, to say something and have it be heard and have it be understood that this is a legitimate concern. Does that answer your question? Yeah. But yeah, language is an issue, and I think when you're talking about remote operations, you're talking about developing procedures to compensate for some of the cues that you lose. And ensure the flow. Yes?
Has there been any Has there been any conclusions drawn on when you introduce a remote person into a team in terms of bringing them up to speed, and whether it's domain knowledge or team or culture knowledge?
Yeah. There's, the guidelines would say as soon as possible, and the guidelines would say, the research would say, it's best if you can do that face-to-face. So a practice that you'll see often is that the remote team member travels at least to the headquarters to meet some of the team members that are there, and the team leader, and get a briefing and get some guidance on roles and responsibilities, so that person knows exactly what to do. Yeah, I would say from the beginning. You know, I talk about the communication delay and the 10 minutes back and forth and the time loss. When you're talking remote teams, whatever you don't accomplish right at the outset takes so much longer to repair than if you're talking about a face-to-face team, that you really want to start off as well as you can. And you're the whole Kanban process. I mean, you're used to, this is what you want to do. You want to figure out what everybody's doing. You want to figure out what the priorities are. You want to keep track of what everyone's doing. This should be all natural to you, and it's just a matter of extending it. Other questions? Yeah.
How about content-rich communications? Respect to time versus space.
In terms of content-rich communications, time versus...
Correct. If I know my message is going to take 5 minutes to get to you, I want to pack as much information in that message as possible. Is that
Yeah.
becoming a problem now with the different forms of communication?
Okay, packing a lot of information into a message is more of a problem in some media than others, right? So one of the things we're training the people that will be going into space is to repeat important information. So that if you give a list of things, you may want to go back and say, okay, the most important parts are on page 5 and 6, or the most important aspects of this plan are that we do X, Y, and Z. You also want to signal what's coming. So you may want to, if you have a voice communications, you may want to say, I'm going to give you the list of important stuff now. And we've started doing that, though, at the time delay as well. We're going to give it to you now, so be ready to hear this. And also, you may want to use a text medium or a kind of electronic bulletin board or some of the link sites or the sites that have the conferences, teleconferences, some of those sites to share information. But be cognizant of that. Yeah.
Kathleen, if I could, while it's really critical with remote and time delay or noisy space, a lot of what you're describing is already being done in current air traffic control, where if you're in a crowded airspace, I don't really have a question. I guess this is more like an example. So in a crowded airspace, somebody talking, the first thing that comes out of their mouth is the name of the person they're talking to, usually by call sign. So air traffic control will call out the aircraft, or the aircraft will call the air traffic control center that they're talking to. So that's the first thing. And so that immediately, if you hear your name, you immediately pay attention, because that's the first thing that happened. Then they read off a string of instructions, and the training tells you which parts of those instructions are required to be repeated back, or some of it's information, some of it's instruction. Instruction first, information second, and then there's parts of it that you have to, they call it read back. So there's already that, and then it's so that at least they know you've heard them. So changes in altitude, changes in direction, changes in speed, crossing certain things at certain altitudes, and then doing something else. All those are the required parts. The fact that you've been, expect this doesn't mean anything. Altimeter setting doesn't mean anything. Wind speed doesn't mean anything. That's just information. So it's all part of the protocol in the standardization of the language. So there's a lot to be learned from stuff that they're already doing. Like you said, air traffic controls figured this out 40 years ago. And
some of the big problems with that are getting yourself heard. If you're coming into Chicago and there are...
Or NorCal.
Yeah, or NorCal, coming in. And also people I sat in with one of the people at a company called Air Inc. that handles all of the data link communications in the ocean, across the ocean where there's not direct radar control or communication with ATC. And boy, they pick up on the first, they're used to listening, and they hear it right away and they start typing. After years of practice, you get used to doing that. But if you're not used to doing that, you could miss something. And often you'll hear, ATC say again, or ATC, was that for me? Was that for TWA? TWA, I was going to say. I used to work for TWA. It's sad that they're gone, but that's still my call sign. And so a lot of it is proceduralized. And another thing that's happening in aviation operations is that the bandwidth is not big enough to hold the amount of traffic that's coming up. So more of the communication from air traffic control is going to come directly to the computers on board the aircraft. So they're changing the mode of communication. And there are all kinds of issues involved in changing that mode. So do pilots look at it as carefully as they listened to it? Do they see the implications? Do they, how long before when you hear something that's kind of out of the routine, you kind of identify it right away. Will you see something that's out of the routine once you start seeing it on a screen rather than hearing it in your ear? Yeah.
He said you just use all caps, that'll work.
So that's what we train. That's what we're training. If you're training, people using text medium and something important, we train them to type in all caps because that emphasizes it. Either repeat it if you're saying it, type it in caps if it's important. Tell people that you're going to say something or give them something important that they need to pay attention to. All of the signal cues that may not be so important when somebody's sitting across from you. You can say, hey, did you hear what I just said? Kind of thing. And you can't do that when it's a remote communication. Yeah.
Okay, so this kind of makes me think. So within the typical context I'll deal with, it won't be like there are remote teams. We do have time delays.
Yes.
Like effectively, that email is communicating time delay.
Asynchronous, right?
Asynchronous. And then we also have things like teleconference, video conference, not so much, but let's say teleconference, where there isn't the visual cue. And like I normally think of, is there probably with a better protocol that could be improved? Is there anything about that? Like just, let's say that's video. Teleconference is almost a simpler scenario about how is, even that, how could that be more effective? It's not asynchronous, but we have I don't know when to say anything, you don't know when to say anything, and there's no cue.
There's no cue. And sometimes they accompany them with, visuals, but those are hard to do. There's a really good video on YouTube, have you seen that? It's the teleconference where everybody that's on the teleconference is actually sitting in the room, but they're talking into the phone that's in the middle and doing a teleconference. Go to YouTube and look at it, and you'll see.
Yeah, and that's what I was thinking of.
Yeah.
That's a practical problem we don't deal with. It gets harder than that.
It's hard, yeah. And those are really tough, and it's hard also for you to stay engaged when you're on one of those because there's a lot of information. So if you are conducting one of those, how will you keep people engaged? I don't have a good solution for that. They're tough. I guess it has to be a really engaging topic and, I don't know, some good pictures or good information. We're still good, I think. Yes?
I don't know if this will quite fit your research, but I'm curious, remote employees, how you share reward. For example, a lot of times, we're successful in something small. So what we end up doing is maybe go run to Starbucks or something like go to. So how do you do that with a remote employee, and does your research cover that at all?
Well, the research says, that if you want good team performance, you reward team performance rather than individual performance. And so many, you'll see this all the time in sports teams. Supposedly they want the team to play as a team, but what they're actually doing is getting particular individuals to really kind of take over, and they reward that individual. When you're talking about remote teams, I assume that you would, go back to the cultural stuff. So what's important? What would be a good reward for your other team members? And can you do something that brings the team together for a reward? That would be, a really nice thing. The literature would definitely say that is a good thing, often an impractical thing. But I think finding something that is of equal value that everyone gets, maybe not Starbucks, but if one of your people is in Vienna, maybe a pastry and something that's an equivalent. But one of the things you lose with remote teams is the ability to go out together. And I think that's a real good team building thing, to share successes. And we haven't quite figured that out yet. They do have telecon links where you can see people celebrating up in the space station as well as on the ground. So
Well, thank you, Dr. Mosier.
Thank you.
And
Thank you for your attention.
appreciate your information.